Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 27th of August. Today we've seen so many changes specifically on the Pokrovsk front. It's one of the most significant days in terms of territorial changes since the front line has really shifted in the direction of that particular city. So we're going to get straight into that. But first, I have to discuss the situation in Konstantinivka and Vodyane more generally, because we also have a capture of a particular village over here. Let's zoom in and see the changes first towards the village of Vodyane. You can see in yellow, these are the changes that occurred since my last video, so 2 days ago. Let's zoom in and see. So the Russians were able to gain control over this small sliver of territory located generally east of the 0532 highway. Now, as we zoom in, you'll see that they were able to fully consolidate control over the stronghold that is basically built in between an intersection. This intersection of the highway going southwards, connecting between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar, and the rail line that goes diagonally in the northwestern direction towards Vodyane. And so it's really strategically placed for that reason. And it's a well-built defensive node with concrete pillars. And the Russians, in my last video, I talked about how they were able to take it over and they raised a flag over there. Now, since then, they've also released another video which shows, again, another flag raising event. And it shows that the Russians have actually reached the intersection itself, along with other portions of the highway, and have basically gotten control over the nearby tree lines. And so at this point, the Russians do have rather solid positions, fortified positions, that are rather close to the positions in Vodyane, if we're going to measure it out, around 1.9 kilometers. So the Russians really are making this preparation clear by cleansing any sort of Ukrainian presence east of the highway, solidifying it, and also making sure that they have control over routes located on higher elevated areas, such as this one over here, to my knowledge, and a few ones to the south as well, that naturally lead into Vodyane through either tree lines or just open fields with paths that are pushing towards that region. And so Vodyane is the immediate goal. You could see that it's one of the only villages in the region. And so, as I said in previous videos, and I'll continue to reiterate it because it's the thinking that the Russians are going through when they advance through here. This serves as a glue connecting between the Ukrainian garrisons in Vuhledar that are connecting to Bohoya Valenka, and then to the north, the chain of villages of this basically river valley that connects to Ospanivka. And all this region that I'm going over with these red lines is in a low-lying region and feeds out of Konstantinivka, which we're now going to get to, because in this region, the Russian forces have been able to make a rather quick advance when you look at it, because previously the front line here, the Russians were able to pick up the pace, basically. And we talked about this in the previous video, how the Russian forces were able to spot a gap in the Ukrainian line in the southern flank, exploit it, or reach a local Ukrainian fallback line, exploit that, of course, storm it under drone support, artillery support, all the way to the actual southern outskirts of Konstantinivka, and then from there raise up their flags in the southern outskirts of the town. And so they did that, and then in the days since then, they've been able to advance through a lot of the gray zone in the center of the village with less Ukrainian resistance than usual. Because if you would recall, first in Novohrodivka and then in the eastern parts of Konstantinivka, the Ukrainian resistance was so fierce. In Novohrodivka, it was just never-ending Ukrainian holdouts or counterattacks, and just a complete coordination between artillery, drone crews, ground operatives, and they were able to constantly push back or at least hold the line within the houses of Novohrodivka. And also, of course, we always talk about how the 79th Brigade is able to repel large vehicular assaults that occur in the southern flank of some of these villages. And so the same story was repeating around Konstantinivka until that southern flank began to started to become more and more apparent. And so this exposed a glaring hole in the Ukrainian line. They were not able to maintain a control located basically in this eastern portion where I have this vertical line showing for you guys, because the Russian forces, for about a week and a half maybe, or maybe even more by now, 2 weeks plus, they've been in control over this region in X. And these are, of course, the eastern parts of Konstantinivka. And the Ukrainians, they had forward squads operating nearby, trying to, of course, contain that advance to prevent a full capture. But with the pressure coming in from the south, the Ukrainians were already enveloped, because from the north, they were really being put under a lot of stress due to the Russians opening up attacks from that region last week. And also because The Ukrainians to the north are cut off by the Sukhi Yali River, which is a low-lying river, but again, it is a geographical barrier. And so the Ukrainians here were not in a good situation. Not only are they overlooked, but again, their supply lines are being threatened. And so they likely had to retreat really, really quickly, because we see that over the course of 2 or 3 days, the Russian forces were able to capture around 1.5 square kilometers. In actuality, it could be more, because I still have marked in blue this northern part of Konstantinivka, but I don't see any feasible way for the Ukrainians to be holding out here, because they have facing their backs the river here, and so it just wouldn't make sense to hold on to it. So in all likelihood, the Ukrainian squads and Russian drones actually recorded FPV strikes onto some of these vehicles. They made a very hasty retreat, and this is again mainly 79th Brigade, to Antonivka and Kateryinivka. And these again are villages that have similar formats to Novomikhailivka and Konstantinivka. The difference is now they are more integrated into various other villages. They're closer to the main sort of supply hub and command hub in this theater, Uspenivka, and they're also at a diagonal sort of placement. It's not fully horizontal like Konstantinivka is, which makes it susceptible to attacks from flanks in angles that are really threatening to the Ukrainians. And so some of that is a bit less apparent with these villages over here. So the Ukrainians have likely just given up on defending here, understanding that it was not worth it and that they could be potentially cut off. And so the units operating around here include 31st Brigade, the 16th Territorial Defense Brigade, 61st, I think. Yeah. And so they are generally elements that are operating either within the village with the 79th Brigade or southwards, trying to contain the Russian advance from crossing past the highway. But as you can see, the Russians have now been able to take over, probably control over all of Konstantinivka, based on this video showing 2 Russian soldiers raising a flag in the western portion. And you can see based on the overhead imagery that a lot of the houses here are destroyed, especially in the eastern portion. Some of the fires and smoke are still going and spreading. And so there were recent battles here, but you could see the Russians actually running out in the open, and they don't stay there for a long time. So clearly the front line is still in a state of flux in the region between Konstantinivka and the 2 other villages here. But this really is a big piece of movement, because the Ukrainians have been able to successfully mount campaigns in Novomikhailivka, for example, by dragging their feet out for many, many months to then give them time on the rear to build up defenses. And it's not actually worked this time with Konstantinivka, given the amount of time in comparison. All right, so now I really want to focus on the Pokrovsk direction. We're going to work our way from the southeast to the northwest. There are so many changes that you can see in yellow, indicating Russian advances over the past 48 hours. Just to begin, the Russian forces have fully cleansed Ukrainian presence east of the Vovcha River. This means a full capture of the hamlet Novohrodivka, along with the hill located south of it, which simply on a local level gives the Russians an elevation advantage overlooking the reservoir crossing in Karlivka itself. And so that's important to keep in mind. It really gave the Russians the momentum to continue advancing further westwards, clear out the rest of these dachas here in the X marking, and also take over the crossing. So now this puts Karlivka in really a lot of danger, because the Russians over the past week have been putting pressure along the E50 highway directly into Karlivka. And now you have the Russians with the possibility to, of course, cross over from the east or even attack from the north. And so a lot of these really massive strongholds that were constructed by the Ukrainians over this past year with the hope of preventing horizontal attacks towards the Ukrainian western bank of the river, now they've been rendered superfluous, because they're in a gray zone and they're being flanked from several directions. And you're going to see that as we go forward and look at the situation around Kalinove. So I talked about this, and it's not really a surprise, because you could see in this reddish color the front line 48 hours ago and how Kalinove was in the process of being enveloped. So the Russians have been employing the same strategy, going from small village to small village, infiltrating the flanks through tree lines, and that is usually happening on foot, and then also through fields using, of course, mechanized assaults in a rather small scale in actuality. And so there really are a myriad of factors contributing to why Kalinove fell so quickly. As we said before, the flanks, that's really dangerous, because Kalinove could have been cut off rather quickly, with the Russians only about a kilometer away from the E50 highway, which would then have fully cut off Kalinove. Also, the Russian forces are continually advancing along the same ridge that I've been warning about that they would advance through, and they've been doing it since they captured Mykolaiivka. So you have this large X that I'm marking in red, and it extends basically southwards. It doesn't necessarily pass through Kainova, but just west of it. And so the Russians have holdings that are directly overlooking the village, and also a lot of the trenches and dachas located northwards that are basically extensions of Kainova that also include a vertical road connecting the two areas together. And so that region is overlooked by the Russians. At the same time, the Russians were advancing along the western bank of the Vavcha River, and in the process getting control over some of the nearby tree lines. You could see that in yellow. Also advancing inwards from holdings in Ptiche, and then using that as a direct vector for their forces to go through the ravines, and of course to use the foliage for their concealment to infiltrate into Kainove. And so you can see, based on this footage from the 27th of August, that the 114th Brigade DPR unit raised their flag, confirming Russian control without much of a fight. You could see in the footage that most of the houses don't have much damage. This is due to the fact that the Ukrainians never were able to mount a successful defensive campaign here. So their forces, which we're going to go through, include the 68th Jaeger Brigade and their Shershin drone unit. It also includes 59th Brigade, but the 59th Brigade has a presence a bit further to the south around Karlivka, but also to the east in Nevelske and in Krasnohorivka. You also have the 56th Brigade. 56th Brigade has not been heard from as much in recent months, but they are still operating around here, likely in the Karlivka area. And so their presence was not supposed to be directly related to the Pokrovsk front. They were more so involved with defending in the Karlivka region and in field southwards, but due to this very quick Russian advance that has expanded in the southern direction, they're now being flanked. Their holdings are being flanked from the north, and they have no choice but to get involved with the defense in areas like Mimrik and even along this trench line that is marked in yellow that is basically adjacent to the Vavcha River. You can see it marked in red over here, includes villages such as Halitsinivka and various other ones around here. And this was a part of Ukraine's fallback line once they were to lose full control over the perimeters of Nevelske and Krasnohorivka, because I've been stressing this for so long, and it's actually now beginning to manifest in reality. These holdings, they can't be held onto forever, so the Ukrainians have been planning for a long time to create this connection line between Karlivka to Kurakove. Now, a lot of those villages that were supposed to act as the nodes where the troops would be stationed, they are being flanked from the north and are in immediate danger of being taken over by the Russians. You can see that based on the maximum Russian advance, they're only about 1.8 kilometers away from the Vavcha River. So these positions could be flanked, and of course they're facing and their backs the Vavcha River, so they can't really withdraw across that river into danger. They're going to have to withdraw westwards towards this vertical line, which is east of Selydove. You can see it here in red. And in the process, they would be ceding a large portion of the trenches that have been building over the past year in some cases, and also give over numerous populated areas that could have served as really important nodes of defense, especially the ridges that are located north of them. Those are really good staging points for defense, but now all of that has been rendered superfluous, as I always say. And then that also puts a big question mark about what's going to happen to the Ukrainian defenders that are still holding out here in Nevelske and Krasnohorivka, as they will be cut off from much of the contact with the rear. So just as a summary, the Russians were able to advance from the Novohrodivka area to the reservoir about 4 kilometers. They were able to advance from Ptiche to Kainove, measuring it about 3 kilometers. And if we're measuring it now, you could see that the Russians are only about 1.8 kilometers from the E50 highway in this region, and they've already crossed over it in the Mimrik area. So here the Russians have been able to advance and create a spearhead of 1.3 kilometers. They've actually been able to enter into this village. It's an area that used to serve as a really important village next to an intersection, because you can see here that leading out of Selydove, the next village past the suburb of Mikhailivka is Memrik. So it served not only as a connection to the Karlivka region, but also southwards towards areas that are more important, like Ukrainsk and Hirnik to the south. And so it really does act as this sort of junction for the Ukrainians, whether they want to go east, west, or south, not necessarily north, Now the Russians are coming in from the north. They've already disabled the Ukrainian defensive capacity in these two strongholds. Again, the fighting here is happening so quickly, and there's so much danger for Ukrainian forces operating near the line of contact. Also, of course, those issues with manpower that they can't organize in enough time a defense unit, a squad even, to go into these certain trenches and hold out to protect the northern perimeter. So the Russians really take advantage of that and really use stepping stones like Selydove or the trench here to the north and are able to enter into Memrik according to Ukrainian sources. And so once they've entered, I'd say by now it's been like 24 hours since this report came out. It's likely that they've been able to occupy the entirety of Memrik because the Ukrainians simply don't have the capacity to organize forces and conduct a prolonged defense against the Russian forces here that have momentum in a settlement such as Memrik. Now, this is really a big issue because you could see how this potential Ukrainian fallback line that I was talking about, this vertical line that is east of Selydove, could be infiltrated in an area that is very, very close to Ukrainsk. And the fall of Ukrainsk would be a really big blow because Ukrainsk acts as a sort of buffer in between what could be the front line and Ukraine's last fallback line in this region. This fallback line, you can see it's rather intricate. It was built to connect various tree lines, and it doesn't go in like a horizontal or vertical direction. There are zigzags. It's mainly protecting the southeastern flank of Selydove, and that's very important because all this general region that is south of Selydove is located in a high elevation, and so is Ukrainsk. Ukrainsk has a terracon and a mine that is located just to the west of it. Those positions are so important, it could play a huge role in overlooking Selydove and all the villages located to the west of it, along with, of course, the rail line. The rail line itself is on high elevation, but it could, of course, be huge danger to the city of Selydove itself, which already has threats that we're going to get into from the north. So just to recalibrate for a second, another big threat from Ukrainsk would be an advance southwards towards other villages that are located along the Vovcha River, but a bit further downstream in an area like Hirnik, Krakivka, and this would again render superfluous a really massive Ukrainian ridge that is located north of this particular reservoir here that is in the Krakova region and is also located south of Ukrainsk. This was supposed to be a massive Ukrainian linchpin that could overlook any Russian advance in the nearby perimeter and just continuously fire towards those regions and prevent any sort of Russian effort, any sort of large grouping from getting closer, whether it be from an area like Novohrodivka or from Krasnohorivka. That was the goal, to prevent basically horizontal attacks. But now all this region is under threat of being taken over from Russians advancing from similarly elevated areas, coming in basically from the northeast along the same defensive ridge that the Ukrainians wanted to utilize. And so it's very important to bring this up because I'm just following elevation and just natural geography here. And that's what I've been doing since the start. And that's how it's been playing out this entire time. And so just looking a bit to the west now, you have Mikhailivka. The Russians have been able to cross the E50 highway here for a while now. They've been able to pass through the first line of trenches on Selydove's eastern perimeter. They've been able to enter into the first houses of this suburb and also take over the nearby slag heap and mine facility. This is really big because now the Russians, of course, they have elevation on their side more generally, but now they have specific high points, higher than all the surrounding regions, only rivaled by the nearby slag heap, which the Ukrainians have under their control. But it is so close to where the Russians are now, there's a question of whether they'll be able to hold on to it. The fall of both these slag heaps would give the Russians immediate pressure on the northern flank of the entirety of Selydove, including the roads that are leading into it, both the E50 highway and also the roads leading into the center itself. And so it's really imperative for the Ukrainians to hold on to the slag heap and to contain the advances to this region over here, because you can see how the gray zone is already forming with Centralna Avenue really turning into a no man's land at this point, with most of the Ukrainian formations here operating in the center and Selydove itself in the center. It's a large settlement, of course, but it's located on a river valley, the Solona River Valley. You can see the river here. It has, of course, some high points in the center, like a citadel, but again, based on the dynamics, based on the pressure from the flanks, it's really in huge danger. And up until like a week or two ago, there wasn't a huge worry of an imminent collapse here. There really wasn't. Of course, they were near the range of shelling at a certain point, and they were getting closer and closer to the front line. but at a predictable pace, and the situation was thought to be under control. That all changed when the Russians captured Mykolaiivka about, like, let's see when the video is from, August 15th. So that's nearly 2 weeks ago, 12 days ago now. And that's when the situation radically changed, because that's when the Russian forces were able to advance southwards along the ridge and then move their focus westwards and cross over those unmanned trenches. Because let's be honest here, the Ukrainians do not have a sufficient troop concentration in this part of the front line. And they have been worrying about so many other parts of Pokrovsk. And of course, more generally in this war, they've been worrying about so many fronts like New York and Kursk more recently, that not much has been left for areas like this. Selydove really became an afterthought. A lot of the reinforcements that were actually coming into this area were moved northwards to an area like Mirnohrad, Pokrovsk, and Hrodivka, and not as much to the area of Selydove. And so we're still not sure how many Ukrainian defenders and which particular units have been moved in recently, and which ones are just here originally from the past couple of months that have been pushed back into this region. Because, of course, we said there's the 68th. I didn't mention 47th Brigade, but they're still operating around here. There are some National Guard reinforcements and the Special Purpose Battalions. A few battalions of territorial defense units should be operating around here. And you have, of course, as I said before, National Guard elements, specifically the 15th Karadag National Guard Brigade. They were operating as like border guards around the Orikhiv front for a while, not with the most responsibilities there, but now they've been moved to here because the Ukrainians, they do lack many other mechanized forces to move away from their reserve. They don't have many left, so instead they're opting to move units that don't have as much of an impact in less important parts of the front line. And so you can see that not only with the 15th, but also with some of the other regiments in this region. But as we're going to zoom in, you'll see that the Russians, just to sum it up, were able to advance around 3 kilometers deep into Mykolaiivka and going northwards. Now we're going to look at Novohrodivka. So Novohrodivka, the Russians here were able to take over an area amounting to 7.3 square kilometers. Looking at the massive polygon that I went through over these past 10 minutes, the Russians were able to capture 27 square kilometers. That is just a significant advance, much more than any other that I've talked about throughout the course of these battles here. But to focus on Novohrodivka, for a while now, there have been reports from Ukrainian and Russian sources alike that the Ukrainians were forced out. They were not able to mount a successful defensive operation here. And so many withdrew to this trench line over here that is marked in yellow, or to the fields to the west with those higher elevated areas. But we didn't have enough concrete proof of a deep Russian infiltration. But over the past 2 days, we've received footage to confirm the Russians are pushing through, mainly on foot. So you can see August 25th. This is from the Traveler drone units, which is one of the main units operating here. I have no idea which brigade they're attached to, whether it's a mechanized unit that's operating around here, maybe even the 150th Brigade or 151st Brigade that was recently moved into defending the Hrodivka region, or maybe it's a National Guard unit. But regardless, they've been releasing compilations recently that have been geolocated to the center of Novohrodivka, to the private residential area. And you can see how, based on reporting from Ukrainian sources, they admit that the Russians have been able to take over the local hospital, schools, some of the duplexes and apartments. What's still left in a gray zone, based on the reporting from today, are the southernmost houses that are more rural in nature, and also some of the positions in this particular factory that are entrenched. So perhaps there's still Ukrainian holdouts over there. We don't know. We also know that the Russians have been able to advance really, really deep using the windbreaks along the rail line, and of course the higher elevation along that embankment. They've not been able to, they haven't been repelled by the Ukrainians. They just continue to advance along this one particular vector, and it's yielded them a lot of gains recently. And so you can see this based on geolocations from August 27th of, once again, the Traveler drone unit dropping really dozens of grenades. And this probably is at nighttime, but dropping dozens of grenades from their drones onto houses where Russians are located in. And that's enough confirmation to show us that the Russians are operating really deep into Novohrodivka, because basically the southern parts of the town is a town in and of itself when you compare it to the smaller portion that is located to the northwest. And so that southern portion is largely either under Russian control or a gray zone, where there was a hope by the Ukrainian side that they would be able to stabilize the situation around the boundary between these two portions near the rail junction But you can see that the Russians have already passed that point using the windbreaks and have infiltrated into certain portions of this northern section of Novohrodivka. In total, they've been able to advance, if we're measuring it here, 3 kilometers, nearly 2.75 kilometers. This means any sort of Ukrainian defense here really is reliant on the final few houses and this local slag heap, plus the one to the north. And so they are rather close to the trenches, this really large defensive structure that was built as a sort of second to last fallback line before reaching Pokrovsk. So then there's a question about whether the Ukrainians are at a point where they no longer have the wherewithal to defend in this town, and they're just going to withdraw a couple hundred meters northwards to an area that is actually prepared for such defensive operations. But what we do know is that definitely the Russians do enjoy taking advantage of this rail vector. And so we could see that continue, and that could be an avenue through which the Russians are looking to break through this Ukrainian line of defense, which they are really, really close to reaching. And speaking of which, if we're looking at this region already, the Russian forces have been able to advance deeper into Krasny Yar, even according to Ukrainian sources. This was done through the vertical or diagonal road, in Zhuravka. And now they've just begun the cleansing operations here because the Ukrainians don't really have a means by which to defend here in either Krudy Yar or Krasny Yar, because these two villages are located on really low elevation, and there's no point in holding on to them if there are more defendable positions on higher elevation, or at least more defended regions in trenches located just to the west or just to the north in Mykolaiivka and Novohrodivka. So leading into Krasny Yar, the Russian forces have advanced a total of around 600 meters. And this is really threatening because having two villages right next to this defense line could give the Russians an organization point to break through this defense line and cause even more problems for the Ukrainian garrison closer and closer to Novohrad. So they really should be keeping an eye out for any sort of exploitation that occurs in this red rectangle that I'm marking for you guys right now. Then just to finish off with Horodivka, there are murmurs, and maybe by the time this is recorded, there's a change in the situation, but there are still murmurs about the Ukrainians withdrawing from the town, but still no geolocated evidence of Russians occupying the center or advancing past where we know they've been now for, let's see, maybe about 12 days as well. So they've really made it a foothold in this eastern portion, but have not made a concerted effort to push deeper, at least based on publicly available information. And that would make sense if they're expecting that the Ukrainians are not going to be able to hold out for long, and that it's better to just strike them from the air using drones, targeting their logistics and artillery airstrikes, whatever it may be. And definitely there has been a lot of bombardment of this paved road between Horodivka and the southern suburbs of Novohrad. A lot of vehicles going back and forth have been targeted by drone crews, fixing strikes onto those areas. And you do have here the mention of a few units, including National Guard Regiment, as we talked about before, this National Guard Brigade, actually, 151st Mechanized Brigade. And again, just to make it clear, a lot of the units that are also being moved into this region are elements that have previously had no combat experience. They were created last year and were filled up with a lot of the recently conscripted Ukrainian soldiers, so not as much experience. Training, of course, is rather lacking, and also there may be issues with the amount of equipment that is given to them. It's questionable whether they even are mechanized at this point. But in any case, they've been moved to this area to act as a stopgap to prevent further losses. So I would just say keep an eye for what develops here, because past Horodivka, the Ukrainians do have this sort of semicircle perimeter to defend against attacks from all directions, basically. And they have this higher elevated region to the west, which will be finally an area where they do maintain some sort of superiority when it comes to geography. That also extends southwards into this X over here, which is, of course, southern parts of Novohrad. Southern portion of Novohrad and all of Pokrovsk is located at a high elevation. So once again, that's one of the advantages that the Ukrainians have, even though the Russians mainly are advancing along higher elevated areas. Now, last advance from this region amounts to 2.4 square kilometers. Russian forces advancing through this final corner of these fields, basically a low-lying area, not much of a height advantage, but it is involved in flanking Horodivka from the northeast to put more pressure to the Ukrainians, so less in order to make them withdraw, basically. and you can see it's an advance of around 800 meters westwards. And then going towards the Toretsk River, Russian forces advanced around 1.3 kilometers. They're closing in on the hamlet Novohrodivka, an area that has very little housing and a few trenches. So this area probably is by now a gray zone. The Ukrainians in this region, of course, would like to use the Toretsk River as a natural barrier to prevent Russian crossings. But in an area like Novohrodivka, it is really shallow and narrow. So there is an opportunity to cross over here, just as there is in a few other areas over here. And really from there, this is not as important to the Battle of Pokrovsk, but it is important more generally to the front line over here. The Ukrainians do have a bit of a stronghold node in between the highway here, the highway that is leading into Pokrovsk, and the Russian front line near the river. The area that is in the X in between the two parallel lines is located on a rather high elevation, and you can see how there are trenches structured here to act as layers that really are robust, at least on paper. And so the hope would be that the Ukrainians could hold on here and still put pressure onto the Russian salient that is advancing deeper and deeper towards Pokrovsk and Novohrodivka from this northern flank. And so this is much more of an afterthought than some of the events that are going on to the west, but just keep in mind that the Russians would definitely like to cut off this road here, maybe not even for Pokrovsk anymore, but more generally to disconnect the connectivity of the Ukrainian forces in this region. And the way to do that would be through this really dense trench area that the Ukrainians are hoping will hold out. And now, finally, looking at New York, we have a small update from the Vodyane unit, 100th Mechanized Brigade. Their FPVs hit a Russian MTLB and various positions in what looked like rural areas just east of the Novaya mine. This again shows the Russians are consolidating control over the hinterlands between the suburbs of Toretsk and the center of the city itself. You can see here the advance amounts to, let's see, measuring it out from east to west, it is about 350 meters westwards, and the Russians are very close to taking over the final bastion of high elevation that the Ukrainians maintain in this hinterland region. Of course, to the west, the Ukrainians do still have many heights that are supposed to provide cover for the center of Toretsk, but in terms of immediate ones from the east, this is the last one, and it has already become the site of fighting. So the Russians have really advanced through here quickly, and at the same time, they are getting close to connecting with the Russian garrison that made inroads into the Zabalka region, the Zabalka suburb from the south. So you could see a scenario in which there's pressure onto this southern district of Toretsk, this one here, both from the east and both from the south. That is something that's becoming a really large potential reality. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and sorry for making this really long video, but I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.